first got involved in Occupy as a reporter for Waging Nonviolence. This was the midst of the 2011 uprisings around the world. And from afar, we'd been covering all that had been going on in the Middle East and spreading across Europe. And one of the things that we were really interested in was what happens before something like this, an uprising, hits the streets. You know, we'd known people who'd been training activists in Egypt and in other places, and knew that this movement that seemed to be spontaneous had longer roots. So I started attending meetings in mid-August of 2011, which was, I think I attended the third big meeting. And at this time they were having them, I think, every week. And so this was a little more than a month before the September 17th, when the protests began. At the time, it was maybe 70 to 100 people in a circle, probably less than 100. And they were mainly young, a lot of international people. That's something that I think people in the US have trouble seeing, is that many of the early participants saw themselves as participating in a larger global movement rather than simply starting something in the US. And so a lot of the kind of strategies and tactics were directly coming from the other uprisings happening around the world. And so for them, it was really, how do we join this? And there were a lot of debates about what to do. You know, was the goal here to make one policy demand, as the initial call from Adbusters magazine had said, or was it something else? And you know, one thing that was interesting in those meetings is I was able to see exactly how one side kind of won there, and what came out was something much less of a policy platform making a demand of the system as it is, and much more, for better or worse, a movement that was focused on creating space and on kind of radical self-education and expanding the horizon of possibilities rather than placing a demand into the current set of possibilities. And that you know, I think there's something to criticize about that, but there was also something I think very powerful about that kind of collective decision, a decision that not everybody was happy with, but one that really seemed to prevail. And it ended up being, in some ways, a conflict between people who were more politically oriented, who were trying to achieve particular goals and already had those goals in mind, and a group of people who were who were in many cases artists, and whose primary interest was in creating experience and in shaping experience. And interestingly, you know, it was the artists who ended up winning the arguments. I'm not sure they persuaded everyone. I know, in fact, that they didn't, but they ended up, you know, becoming, you know, implanting their approach into the DNA of the movement in really powerful ways that spread and kind of were taken up by people who didn't even know where these ideas had come from. But the idea that, you know, that consensus would be used, that there would be kind of radical autonomy, no liaisons with the media, no liaisons with the police. That was a big debate. For instance, should we have police liaisons? If you're mounting a big protest for a particular purpose and you're just showing up for that purpose and you want to show your strength, it's very common to have strong relationships with the police because they're going to be there. Right. If you're building a radical movement that is premised on maybe questioning the very existence of the police, choosing not to have a police liaison is a way of, in some sense, modeling the kind of world that you're trying to begin working toward. So it chose over and over that kind of you know, you could say utopian, but this kind of performative strategy. And it's important to recognize that this is in the wake of the election of Obama. This is the generation whose first major political event was the election of Obama. All this hope and change rhetoric, limited political outcomes, little range of motion, and so the choice to really, rather than simply make a demand of the system, which so clearly had demonstrated its limitations, to instead step back and say, we are really, this is really not working for us. We're not also happy with the options you're presenting us. What options do we want? And in that sense, Occupy really opted for to become a movement of vision and of holding space and of building community and building a kind of utopia in the streets, rather than simply a movement built around one particular policy demand. But that was an important turning point, because it set the movement on this track that said, we are building space. We are building, the idea of this anarchist theorist Hakeem Bey of a temporary autonomous zone was one that people would refer to a lot, and that too starts verging into churchy stuff, right? This was not in any way a consciously, explicitly religious community. I did not feel like an outlier at all. I mean, I was surrounded by people who probably did not have, religious affiliation in any respect. Yet at the same time, I felt very at home. I'd come up in this kind of Catholic radical tradition in which the street is a holy place, in which embracing poverty for the sake of justice is, a very old game. And so the things that they were doing, the things that they were talking about, the idea of living your values in the most radical way that you can in a space of shared community, is to me incredibly core to what the Christian movement is all about. And so I actually felt in some ways more at home than I had in many religious spaces. And just to say something personally, this is a mystery I still am sorting out. But I'm a convert. I became Catholic when I was a teenager. It wasn't one of these conversions where you're hit by lightning and suddenly everything is awesome. It was one where to the moment that I was baptized, I was agonizing about whether this was the right decision, and for years and years after. And for years and years after, I really didn't feel comfortable identifying myself as a Christian. I was so uncertain about that identification, about that identity. And for some reason, it was in being present to and documenting and even participating in this protest movement that actually that went away. There was something about that, the reality of what they were doing, that kind of gave me permission to embrace this 2,000-year-old faith and integrate it into myself in a way that I hadn't been able to before. So it's a part of it was too, I saw glimpses in what became that protest of the early church that I had never, now when I read the first books of Acts, I feel a sense of recognition, not to say that they're the same thing, not to say that, this is a perfect facsimile, but, that idea of holding all things in common and meeting everybody's needs. I mean, this was the first thing they do when they show up at Occupy a Square near Wall Street is set up a kitchen, set up a library, set up tents, set up all the things that you need to do to take care of people, right? And there is no money, right? Everything is everyone's. And this is, this is what that early church was doing. There was that sense of being, of seeing a truth, of trying to, not seeing it, not having it, but trying to figure out a truth, asking questions that nobody else around you is asking. I remember having this feeling of being in the subway, coming, I was going somewhere off the square and coming back one day and just feeling like I am not in the real world until I get back there. Right. And I can't but help but imagine that the first Christians felt that way, that they were they were in the midst of a reality that was somehow more real than everything else around them. Again, which isn't to say any of this is perfect. One thing that I really appreciate is, Andrew Breitbart's last film, he died while making it, with Steve Bannon, was this takedown of Occupy. And it documented a lot of the ugliness of the movement. And that ugliness was very real. A lot of the deep negativity of our society was also reflected there. And, and to me, that's also kind of part of the holiness of a genuine social movement, is it includes all the mess of human beings. And that was certainly the case, 10 years ago. So after the movement lost its space in New York, space was this obsession. For a while, it was really looking for spaces, and churches become this kind of point of interest, because these are spaces, right, that claim to represent a lot of the values that this movement sought. And so church spaces became places where people were living, were being harbored. A number of churches around New York City had a coalition called Occupy Faith NYC that kind of helped coordinate this process. Judson Church was a really important space on Washington Square Park, famous old church. And so more and more of these activists start getting to know faith leaders who are holding these spaces and building these kind of mutual relationships. And this is powerful in that it enables the movement to find spaces to keep going, keep doing things. And it also gives these leaders of conventional churches and across New York City a chance to kind of be tested and to become leaders in new ways. And that kind of connection between, not just a practical matter of space, but that sense of shared analysis and shared tradition. Actually, these new ideas and challenges that these young people were bringing up, suddenly to recognize that these had ancient roots and that there were ancient traditions that could actually help amplify some of the cries, the complaints, the calls for transformation that they were making was empowering on both sides. And eventually I ended up co-founding a group called Occupy Catholics. As the movement wore on, particularly after it was evicted from the park in November, it took on a really, really religious hue. People started, partly because people were demanding that Trinity Wall Street, an Episcopal church downtown, share some of its space with the movement, allow it to occupy some of their space. People started embracing all this religious language, and religious leaders across the city started organizing to, for instance, house activists who'd been evicted and didn't have a place to stay. So the role, in this kind of dark hour, the role of religious language and institutions became really important, and there was really no organized Catholic presence. And I began to feel that as a deep problem, as something that I felt called to help address. Even though I'd been working primarily as a reporter through all this, I felt like I had to step out. I met Sister Susan Wilcox. some other people, Father Paul Mayer, both of whom were arrested in an action there. And that night after their arrest, we got together and started scheming about organizing a Catholic presence. And that, that really too was something that unlocked me. This was the first time I had really publicly been putting myself forward as a Catholic, and that was a way in which it just unlocked something really important for me. I see it in just really shifting the sense of possibility. That when it arose, for instance, the Democratic Party was very much in the thrall of this kind of market thinking, neoliberal logic where big things were not really possible. And, you had to kind of work within the constraints that Reagan had set. And that democracy is essentially what is provided by, the Constitution and everything emerging from it. I think today we have, a new generation of people who, through Occupy and lots of other stuff, do not accept those constraints, and that's why that outgrowth, I think, is an important reason why Occupy shouldn't have simply made a demand. That it was so important that it said, no, we're here to ask questions, to ask what is it that we really want, what is it that we really need, and begin building it for ourselves. That kind of paradoxically, I think, has led to certain political achievements, like the surprising rise of Bernie Sanders, the way in which the Democratic Party has kind of since then. I mean, Biden, who was Obama's kind of moderate, running mate, is now operating as, in some ways, a more radical president than Obama was able to be, because no longer are those kind of fiscal constraints, those kinds of imaginative constraints, there so much. What it did so well in comparison to others who were trying to build uprisings at the time, I had some comparisons because I was following these, and what it did so well was challenge every expectation and be interesting because it was mysterious, because it was not fitting a certain rubric, because it was so much built on on this effort to saturate life with democracy in every possible place we could possibly find it. It created this space that was just exciting and reminded us that people are not dumb. They don't want just they don't want just slogans to shout. They want to enter into a more interesting world, and Occupy created that. And a complex world, and a world that doesn't have answers. I think in many ways its early political choices were ones that placed a lot of confidence and faith in human beings, saying, we don't just want to be force-fed answers. We want to enter into the challenge. Where I think it really fell short was in relying so much on the digital tools that were so powerful for enabling it. It was a little like, it was a little sugar pill like. I mean, it was so, in some ways, easy to mobilize people. And this was the case across these movements, that with the new social media tools, very new at the time, they were able to turn people out in ways that were kind of magical. And so a lot of trust and power was placed in those tools. And as a result, people forgot to do the things like building lists, building organizations, building things that could turn into lasting power, knocking on doors, and a lot of the people afterward learned that lesson and went and did those things. But it is really a warning sign, and I think a warning that we have really not learned yet, that virality and quick mobilization on online networks is a very fragile thing, and is something that was built and designed through tools made for advertising, not for organization building, not for building lasting movements. And so if we are going to use technology to build our movements of the future, I think we need to be much more intentional about ensuring that we're, that we're using tools, and that we're using the tools that are out there that in ways that that reflect what the movements need, not just what these platform companies need. So there were so many people at the time trying to tell me what was wrong about all this and what should have been better. And I probably right now, if I went back and talked to myself, I would do the same thing. And the younger me would hear that and say, no, you actually don't get what's going on. I'm not going to listen to you. And I think there was something really, I'm grateful that I took that posture of listening and trying to reflect back. Because I think so many of our movements don't get enough of that. So many of people who don't even get to the point of forming a movement don't get enough of that. I think we need more listening that is not based on what advice you're going to give, but is based on deeply understanding, the experience and the imagination of people who are not ourselves.